What's going on, guys? Welcome to Netsec Explained. This video is going to be a little special. Pentester Academy is doing a little giveaway. All you have to do is submit a walkthrough of one of their labs. So imagine my excitement when I came across their IAM lab for IAM Enumeration. If you haven't dabbled in cloud pentesting, I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun and a great way to experience cloud in a way that most DevOps teams miss when managing IAM permissions. In this video, I'm going to show you two tools that are great for analyzing IAM permissions and looking for privilege escalation within an AWS environment. Now, the lab itself is pretty straightforward. It's a bit of a beginner lab. So if we scroll down, we can see that the objective is to use the access credentials that were given to enumerate users, roles, and policies on the AWS account. So let's go ahead, get started, and click Run. So this is going to take a little bit. It's basically creating an AWS account for us in the cloud environment. In the meantime, while that's happening, just to kind of look at the interface that we have for Pentester Academy, we have a nice little lab walkthrough video. Unfortunately, there's no sound, but it walks through how to look at IAM policies inside of the AWS console, which we'll be taking a look at first. And then it also covers some of the AWS CLI, which we won't be going into so much detail with. And of course, there's a way to download the lab manual. So let's see if this has started. Yes, it has. Let's open up the lab link. And here are my credentials. So the first thing I'm going to take a look at is open up the AWS console. I'm going to grab my username and I'm going to grab the password, sign in, don't save, and let's take a look at IAM. If you've never used the AWS console, you can also search here in the top bar and look for IAM. This is Identity and Access Management. So the first thing I want to take a look at is what kind of user we are. So we have student CCT, and I want to take a look at the policies. So we can look at users, and we can type in student CCT, which is right here. And we can see what kind of policies are enabled. So we have a deny access policy, which denies access to billing, budget, cost and usage reports, denies access to the organization, and any sort of service quotas. So we also have the read-only access, which is a built-in AWS managed policy. And this is going to be a pretty large list of things that we have read and list access to. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we can also take a look at the JSON here to see what exactly our policies and permissions are in JSON format. Cool. Now, ahead of this video, I took a look at a couple of the other accounts, and so there's a few that I want to look at. So there's one here, AD Crow. This is a role that doesn't have any policies applied to it. If I go back, there's a role called Bob, which has a trust relationship of pretty much anybody in the current AWS environment. There's a reason why we can't assume role into that. This requires certain policy that we just don't have, or there might be some other factors that are preventing us from being able to assume role into Bob. And we'll take a look at that when we start digging into one of our tools. We look at the permissions, and Bob has full administrator access permission. We can also look at policies, and there's a policy we're going to want to take a look at called test in this environment. This is a customer managed policy. And in here, look at the policy summary. We have S3 list and read permissions, as well as IAM full access. looking at IAM full access, we could use that to create credentials for other user accounts or other roles. It'll also allow us to modify policies and permissions on other roles. So if we got access to this test policy, then we would be able to escalate our privileges. Now, the question is, who has access to test? At this point, we don't know. It's a little cumbersome to try and find that information, but that's where we start looking at enumeration and IAM policies. So what if we want to look for paths that allow privilege escalation? Or what if we want to look at the relationships between different roles and policies? Well, to do that, we're going to have to look at some tools and use the AWS CLI. But before I move on, if you like what I do and you want to see more, leave a comment down below and let me know what you'd like to see in a future video. Okay, let's take a look at our first tool. So the first tool we're going to look at is actually called Cloudsplaining. And Cloudsplaining allows us to, it's actually a tool built by Salesforce that looks at the IAM policies themselves. And it allows us to identify what policies violate the principle of least privilege. So I'm not going to walk through the installation steps, but I'm going to go ahead and show you how to use it. So to use Cloudsplaining, what we're going to do is configure our AWS environment. So AWS configure, and this is going to ask for an access key ID that we can pull from our credentials here. So here's our access key. I'm going to paste that in, and here is our secret access key, and I'm going to paste that in. Our default region is going to be AP Southeast 1. For IAM, it really doesn't matter. IAM is global across the entire AWS account, so we'll just leave that, and then we'll leave the default format none. Now, to verify that AWS CLI is working, we can just type in AWS STS get caller identity. And this is going to return the identity of the credentials that are being used. So in this case, it's student CCT, which is exactly what we see here on the Pentester Labs little sheet for our credentials. Awesome. So let's go ahead and start Cloudsplaining. Cloudsplaining is pretty easy to work with. So we just type in Cloudsplaining. Actually, before I do that, you can see the history there. So there's nothing in this directory, but to download what we need, we can just do Cloudsplaining download, and it's going to take a moment. It's going to query the AWS API, and then it's going to pull down all the IAM information that we need. So once this is done, it's going to save it as default.json. Since default is the name of the profile that I'm using, you can change your profile, but you can follow the Cloudsplaining documentation for that. So let's go ahead, do the Cloudsplaining scan, and then our input file, which is just going to be default.json. So this is going to go through, it's going to analyze the policies and permissions across all of the IAM services, or across all of the IAM policies, and it's going to spit out this nice little report. So this report's kind of cool. It can show us opportunities for privilege escalation, data exfiltration, resource exposure, credential exposure, and any ability to modify the infrastructure. Now, not all of these are malicious, and so this is why you can see for example, privilege escalation. There is one customer managed policy that allows for privilege escalation. There is one AWS managed policy. This is a built-in policy that you can't remove, but it's flagged here because this policy has actually been applied to either a role or a user account. And then privilege escalation using an inline policy. So let's take a look at each of these. So customer policies, we only have one. It's called test, and it is attached to a principal. That means it's either a role, a user, or a group. And so we see the policy test is attached to the role test, and it offers some resource exposure, service wildcards, which is just bad practice, and then privilege escalation. So in each of these, I can just open up privilege escalation. And I can see that it allows privilege escalation because we can create an access key, which means that we can create credentials or API credentials for any user on the system, even if we don't explicitly have permission by our administrators. We can also create a login profile so that we can actually log in to the AWS console. We could add users to groups. So that means we can add a limited user to a group that has effectively more permissions. And a few other things. And then of course, each of these you can click on and look at the Cloudsplaining documentation to better understand how they're used and how to prevent such things. So I'm gonna shrink this. Credential exposure, kind of the same thing. So this is the IAM access key as well as create login profile. So this allows us to retrieve credentials for a user, and that's why it's in this list. And a few other things, resource exposure, etc. So full access to IAM. You can go through this on your own, but I want to show the policy document. So this is the JSON format policy information that we saw in the IAM management in the AWS console. So let's look at the inline policies. Here it looks like there's a few inline policies. Some of them are called default. The one that I think is the most interesting here is Realm Lambda access. And so you can see as we start scrolling through some of these, there's no interesting information that's being flagged, just some infrastructure modification, which is of course necessary for managing infrastructure. So it's not necessarily a problem, could be considered a false positive. But we see this Realm Lambda access, which allows privilege escalation by doing the same thing. We can create an access key and create a login profile. Cool. So let's scroll up and look at the AWS managed policies. Here we have DynamoDB full access, EC2 full access, S3 full access, S3 read-only access, which will allow your ability for a user to actually look at S3 information, and of course IAM full access. So we can scroll here and we just have the Amazon EC2 full access, which there are opportunities for privilege escalation using EC2, as well as the IAM full access, which of course gives us the ability to basically create credentials. So that is awesome. And then of course we have a nice list of IAM principles, so you can see all of the roles, the groups, and the users, as well as information pertaining to them, including their trust policy and their managed or inline policies. I'm not going to go too much into this, but let me look for the role test, which is here. You can see this is the role test. So I'm going to go ahead, open this up, show. We can see one customer managed policy. So if I click on this, that's the name of the policy that is attached to this role. You can see it offers 10 opportunities for privilege escalation and 74 opportunities for resource exposure. And we can look at the trust policy to see who is able to assume this role. So awesome. The next one I want to show you is called AWSPX. This one's by F-Secure Labs. This is the wiki. I'm just going to go to AWSPX. Cool. So I'm not going to go into details on how to install this, but I will cover some of its usage. It lets us use a nice little graph web interface that allows us to kind of map the relationships between roles and policies, as you can kind of see in this little documentation GIF. So let's take a look, and we're going to go to this next tab. It likes to be ran as root. I've already installed it. We just need to configure it. So AWSPX, and then we're going to type in ingest. As I spell ingest incorrectly. And it's going to ask for the same stuff. And the reason is because this is actually running in a Docker container. So let's go ahead and grab the access key ID and the secret access key. The region doesn't matter and the output format doesn't matter. It's going to go through here. Now, if I remember correctly, I ran into a bit of an issue. You might run into the same issue too. So I found a way to fix it, but I completely blew away the instance and I recreated it. So if we run into that issue again, I'm going to show you how to patch it. And sure enough, we are running into the same problem. So this is actually a different problem. Interesting. To do this, we're going to need to do a little troubleshooting. There we go. We're only going to narrow our services down to IAM, and then we can skip all attacks, but I'm actually going to leave the attacks in. This is where we're going to run into the real error that I was running into. The reason we received that error is because our user account only has read-only access. So it doesn't have the requirements, which is both read-only and security auditor. Let me see if I can find it on here. So it's in here somewhere. This is it. You need security audit, which is required, and then read-only access only if you want to ingest S3 objects. Because we don't have security audit and we only have read access, that's why we were getting that error. So by focusing only on IAM, we have the ability to only look at IAM. We're not creating any sort of modifications or digging further than read-only access allows us. So that's why we're able to move past it. And just to kind of circle back around, let's go ahead and show you that in the console. And here's our read-only access. So if we hop back over, this is the error that I was talking about, this key error for ARN. This is in the attacks.py file. So we're gonna have to do a little bit of a patch. This R source and then bracket ARN, this is actually a dictionary, and for some reason it's causing issues. There is an issue log for this tool right now. Hopefully they fix it so that by the time you get to see this video and you get to kind of play along, you see this key error ARN, and there's a nice little patch. If you scroll down, look at the details, it's the exact same error we ran into, but to patch it, we just need to replace that with get. So because this is a Docker container, I'm going to do docker ps to see where it's located. Docker exec it AWSPX is the name of the Docker container. And then I'm just going to run bin bash and Docker container I need to update before I can install any sort of text editor. This is going to install Nano. And let's scroll up and see where this file is located. So we have opt AWSPX, lib AWS attacks.py. We're already, well, I could just copy this. I don't need to get too fancy. So I'm pressing Control-Shift-C. You can also click, right-click, copy selection. Same thing, right-click, paste selection, or Control-Shift-V. And I'm gonna edit this. I'm gonna press Control-W in order to find that. So I'm looking for ARN, which is gonna be here. Just gonna do a little on-the-fly patching. Gonna exit out and let's rerun the command. So this is gonna re-download everything and then check all of the opportunities for attack. So we'll just give it a moment. Cool, we're done. So now that that's finished, it's actually hosting a web application on our local host, port 80. So it's gonna open this up, connect to the database, and here we are. So the first way to kind of get familiar with this is to open up the advanced search, and we can see here that we can look for any resource to any other resource as our default query. So I'm going to go ahead, click run. And so this is going to map out all of the resources and which resources connect to which. So we saw the test role, which has the test policy. So I can click on here and we see that this is the role test. We can see the trust boundary, which is just anybody from this IAM account. We can also leave notes if we feel like we need to. We can click on the link between the role and the policy to see its relationship, so we can see that it's attached. We can even click on the test policy, which is policy test, and we can look at the document, which is the entire policy documentation. So we can see from test role to test policy, it gives us effective admin. And the organization account access role has a trust boundary, oops, not a trust boundary, has star.star. So this allows us to do STS assume role so that we can assume role into this test account. So we can also see that special KMS can reach AD logging role. Special KMS has AWS Key Management Service Power User. The AD logging role has S3 read-only and has IAM read-only access. So we can take a look at a lot of these. You can see as I zoom out how these kind of connect to each other, MFA policies and such. So the layout, we can use auto, we can set things in a grid, so it's a little easier to see. Sometimes it's easier to see in the default view, and then concentric, so it builds out a small web. So I'm gonna clear the screen. Let's look at, I'm actually gonna click back. Let's look at our student user, which is student CCT. I'm gonna click on this. And so here we are. So I can right click, look for inbound paths, which is going to see who can actually access our user account. We can see anybody who's an effective admin can access our user account. I'll just click on this and press delete. So let's go back, right click, and let's see what our outbound paths are. And I'm going to click auto. So we can see our student user actually has the ability to become the AD logging role. And if we click on this link, we can see that AD logging role is allowed because of STS assume role. Yeah, so I think there's something in the policy that lets us do that for the AD logging role. So let's take a look at that. So let's look at the role, AD logging. Yep, overly permissive trust boundaries. You can already see that there. Trust relationship. This is why. It allows everybody, even people who aren't necessarily given the STS assume role. I'm not going to go into details of how the STS assume role works, but this star is what actually allows us to assume role into this AD logging role. And we can actually check that out by clicking here, click switch role. I'm going to enter in the role name. Just need to grab the account ID. We'll pull it from Cloudsplaining. Here's our account ID. And I'll just leave the rest default. So switch role. And now we are the AD logging role. Cool. So unfortunately, AD logging role doesn't give us the ability to escalate our privileges. You can see IAM read-only access, which we already have access to from the read-only policy, and likewise for the Amazon S3 read-only access. But from here, if we were able to access another role that had more permissions than we had, we'd be able to map it out using AWSPX. So that's how we can do some forward mapping, but let's go ahead, clear the screen, and look for some backwards mapping by taking a look at effective admin. So from effective admin, I want to see all the inbound paths. What are opportunities for users to become effective admin? So this is going to map out the inbound paths. Yep. So this allows anybody who has access to IAM full access to the test policy and to administrator access policy is effectively an admin. So IAM full access is given to the lab creator user account. So if somehow we manage to get credentials for lab creator, then we could effectively become admin. Likewise for Jeswin, AD admission, lab admin, catch deploy, they're all part of test. But it looks like Jeswin also has the policy for administrator access. So let's take a look at that. Let's look at user and then Jeswin. And direct administrator access. We also have the group AD admin, which contains lab creator and AD admission. So we can see lab creator, if we click on here, the user is part of the group, AD admin, and then the group AD admission is attached to AD admin. So here's the list of users that are effectively admin. We also have some roles. So Bob is part of the, I'm gonna click out of that. Bob is part of the administrator access. The organization account access role is also part of the test role, which, well, it actually allows us to assume role. You can see here this STS assume role. And so organization account access, it would allow us to assume role because it probably has the STS assume role permissions. So let's take a look at the role. What was the name of it again? Organization. All right, I need to switch back. So I have my read-only access. The AD logging role doesn't have IAM read access. Organization account access. Permissions has inline administrator access. And that is access to everything, start out star, which includes the STS assume role. We can also look at the inline policies. Oh, that's interesting. It doesn't look like it popped up here. That's okay. And we can see anybody from this account, this AWS account, which is an external account, has access to the organization account. And then likewise, this student maker config 2, anybody with this access key has access to student config 2, and it allows us to navigate. So we can effectively, let's see how this works. So we can effectively create a login profile using student maker config 2. And that would be true for all of these people, all of these users that have effective admin permissions. So if we were part of, had this external API key, we can log in as student maker config 2. We can then log in as lab admin, which assumes the test role, which has administrator access, and then giving it effective admin. Cool. So what I like to usually do right before we wrap up is I like to look at Cloudsplaining, see what policies and what roles have those policies attached in order to map things out and see what things I should take a look at. From there, I can enter in, for example, clear the screen. I can enter in test and look at the test role, which has access to the test policy. I'll click outbound paths. So here we see test role has access to test policy, which then becomes effective admin. And so this lets me map out opportunities for privilege escalation, both forward tracing and back tracing. So that's how I like to use these tools together. I just want to take a look at one last thing. Let's see, inline policies. Let me see if, yeah, Interesting, that organization role didn't pop up with an inline policy. But that's okay, we were able to catch it here. So I'm gonna clear the screen. I'm gonna take a look at the advanced search. There's another way that we can do this. So if we wanna go from basically any principal to effective admin, we can go ahead, click here, and we can see it all mapped out this way. So to become effective admin, we see all of the user accounts. Here's a list of users that have access to administrator access. Lab creator has IAM full access, and through the chain to the test role, we have test policy, which gives us effective admin. Awesome. In this video, we covered how to navigate the IAM section of AWS. We used Cloudsplaining to find policies that go against the principle of least privilege, and we used AWSPX to map out the relationships between policies, roles, and users. We didn't see any opportunities for privilege escalation from the student, but we did find that the student could assume role into the AD logging. Oops, gonna clear this. Student, outbound paths, and there we go. So we can get the AD logging role. Well, that's all I have for you guys today. For more information, check out the links in the description below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to see more videos like this. I'll see you next time.